Welcome, everybody, and thank you for coming here tonight for our follow-up presentation on missile defense. I'm Doris Wise-Montrose. I'm president of Children of Jewish Holocaust Survivors. I want to thank the David Horowitz Freedom Center, which is co-sponsoring tonight's event with us. And I want to thank the Lux Hotel, again, for its generosity in providing the venue and the refreshments for this very important presentation. As one of our guests tonight wrote when distributing the invitation to his mailing list, "You're not going to like what you hear. I hope you don't like it enough to do something, and we will show you how. We must remember that unlike American politicians, when dictators make promises, they keep them." The threat of an electromagnetic pulse attack is real. In addition to what you hear tonight, we have provided literature on the subject. We can all be advocates for our own defense. We have an obligation to our children and generations to come to keep our countries safe. The Congress has recently acted in defiance of the President's threat of a veto to authorize additional money for defense. Secretary of Defense Gates is slashing defense funds at a time when North Korea and Iran are putting virtually all their money into building missiles designed to kill us. So what we can do is to make our Congresspeople, those we have elected to represent our interests, an offer they cannot refuse. They must vote for missile defense and against any bills slashing the defense budget if they want to get reelected. Congress reacts to the voices they hear, and they must hear our voices. We have provided a handout, again at the table in the back, that has the names, phone number, and fax numbers of the members of the Congressional Senate Committee on Armed Services. Call them, fax them. More than once, more than twice. Don't be shy. We are very fortunate to have with us tonight a very distinguished panel of experts in this field. Frank Gaffney, president of the Center for Security Policy. Avi Schnurr, Executive Director of the Israeli Missile Defense Association and of MPAC. And Major General James Spider Marks, after a distinguished career, was the Senior Advisor for National Security Affairs for Romney for President campaign. Our moderator tonight is Janet Levy. Janet is a writer for American Thinker, Front Page Magazine, and Family Security Matters. She has been a guest on radio talk shows throughout the country. Janet has worked for the Center for Security Policy, the David Horowitz Freedom Center, and other organizations fighting the global jihad. Her articles are exceptionally informative, and I urge everyone here to find and read them. One day soon, Janet will start a blog of her own, and you can get them right in your inbox. I will now turn the program over to Janet, who will introduce the guests and start us off. And thank you again all for coming.
Well, I want to start by saying that one nuclear weapon detonated 300 miles above the middle of the United States would be enough to wipe out our nation's power grid. And this is what we're discussing tonight, an EMP, an electromagnetic pulse attack. This means that our country doesn't have to be hit directly to destroy our electrical grid. Get the picture of an EMP attack, a nuclear weapon detonated above the United States, destroying the electronic grid. We're out of power. And this doesn't have to be perpetuated by a rogue nation like Iran or North Korea. This could be an attack by a terrorist group that has adequate funding to be able to finance the necessary components. And within an instant, we would become a pre-industrial society. And our panelists are going to talk more about this, but most of our cars are electronic at this point. They have been for decades. So our cars wouldn't function, planes would fall out of the air, we wouldn't have phone service, law enforcement would be rendered useless, powerless, because they wouldn't have access to their emergency vehicles, to phones, to radios. patients on life support in ICUs or in hospitals would die. There'd be no food and no medicine delivery, no clean water, no sewage, elevators wouldn't work. Anyway, there would be widespread chaos, panic, and lawlessness everywhere as people would desperately be seeking the things they need to stay alive: food, clean water, and medicine. And also people would be trying to frantically locate their loved ones and try to get from point A to point B. There would be people in remote areas, or people, you can imagine an elderly person on the 30th floor of a Manhattan high-rise and the difficulties this would present. So everyone here remembers Katrina. Well, this would be a nationwide Katrina. And I know this sounds a little like science fiction, and I hope that our experts tonight will dispel any notions that you have in your mind that this is kind of like sci-fi. 9/11, think about 9/11, flying planes into buildings. That, how did something like that sound on 9/10? Pretty astonishing. Okay, thanks for the reminder. Anyway, I wanted to recommend for you to get an idea of what this is like. This book by William Forsham, 1 Second After, which gives you a sense of the experience of an EMP attack, what happens after an EMP attack. One other thing I want to mention is we're talking about this tonight, but consider that we're dealing with this at a time when our president is gutting the defense budget and reducing funding to the missile defense program. And this is also a time where we're facing increased threat from terrorist groups and rogue nations like Korea and Iran. Well, tonight we have this illustrious panel of experts, Avi Schnurr, Frank Gaffney, and General Marks, who are going to address several facets of this issue, EMP attack. Frank Gaffney is the founder and president of the Center for Security Policy, a national security and defense policy think tank based in Washington. And Frank is a frequent guest in the media. He's a regular on the Hugh Hewitt radio program. I'm sure you hear him on the radio program. He's a contributor to numerous publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the National Review, and the Washington Times. He recently produced the documentary Islam versus Islamists, and he's the lead author of the book War Footing. And he was an assistant secretary of defense in the Reagan administration as well. Frank Gaffney.
Thank you. The truth of the matter is, if after this briefing you don't want to kill yourself, you get your money back. This is pretty grim stuff. When you hear particularly what Avi said about how comprehensively things that could go bang in the night, as they say, at the direction of some despot half a world away, or things that actually, we hear a lot about global warming. Well, solar flares will really warm things up. These are serious problems, but not insurmountable. And so my job tonight was to sort of pick up on some of the points that Avi made about what we can do about it. And I'll do that, and I'll sit down and we'll hopefully get into a very interactive conversation with you about what you think, because you are part of the solution here. I think a very big part of the solution. Let me just add two things on this sort of threat picture, or what gives this set of facts that Avi's laid before you real moment. One is that we do have a guy, reportedly overwhelmingly re-elected by the Iranian people, by the name of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, it's easy for me to say, who has repeatedly declared that a world without America is not only desirable, but achievable. Now I think, and I would defer to Spider on this, but I think the widespread expectation is that the Iranian government, beavering away as it is on nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles with which to deliver them, will not, in a long time probably, have enough nuclear weapons to eliminate the United States through the sort of archetypal attacks that we used to worry about during the Cold War. You know, drop one on a city or multiple cities or missile silos or what have you. That's not in the cards. Thank God. But as Avi has pointed out, one bomb, well placed, properly designed, could, as they used to say, ruin our whole day. A lot of whole days. In fact, I would suggest you take the world, take the United States back to the 1850s or 1789, and it's a world without America, for all intents and purposes. And then there's the problem of this solar activity. I gather Avi did not mention, but he and I spoke about it earlier today, that one of the other points made in the Commission's report, the EMP Commission's report, is that the city of Toronto, back in 1985, was apparently uniquely exposed to some intense solar activity that had precisely the kind of catastrophic effect on that city's electricity grid that Avi has described could happen nationwide under even more severe circumstances. So bad was it, this episode in 1985, that the Canadian authorities frantically tried to figure out how to get power restored into the city before they were compelled to evacuate it. Think about it. Well, at least they had the option of evacuating all those people to someplace where there would be power and where they would, try to cobble things together until they fixed the transformer or replaced it. Kind of like Katrina, if you think about it. And did you know that there are still places in the vicinity that was affected by that hurricane that are not back up to speed yet? I mean, I'm not talking about people living in FEMA trailers. I'm talking about power not restored and basic services still not up to scratch. That's a microcosm of the larger problem. But let me not dwell on that because you've had enough of it already tonight. Let's talk about a couple of things that can be done. I think the best news of all, in an otherwise pretty grim picture, is that it's practically the only time I can think of in which the United States government has actually already addressed the money part of a problem. Now, he's absolutely right. It hasn't yet started addressing the application of that money in a way that will solve the problem. But at least the money has been authorized and appropriated by the Congress. Your tax dollars potentially at work through the miracle of this gargantuan stimulus bill. Avi mentioned one number, I'm not sure whether it's right or whether it's twice that or 3 times it, but in that $700 billion package is some $20 billion, I think was the number you used, that is earmarked for upgrading our electrical grid. Now, what are the chances that we will upgrade the electrical grid in such a way that will take into account the hardening that would mitigate the vulnerabilities we currently have and ensure we're not simply replicating them in the next generation electrical grid? The point is that if you do it now, if you actually think about it and plan for it and build it into the grid, you save yourself enormous amounts of money. In some cases, maybe even it's impossible, but at least you're building in a solution instead of trying to bootstrap it on after you've built this new complicated electrical production and distribution system. So, if you take away nothing else from all of these conversations, I hope it is that we need to make sure, all of us, solutions to the problem, need to make absolutely sure that the guys and women who are spending that $20 billion on the next generation electrical grid have to take electromagnetic pulse of the man-made variety or the solar flare variety into account, or face charges for malfeasance. And I have to say, this is going to be hard because this is not, as I think Avi mentioned, this is, or maybe Spider, this is not just a government problem. A tremendous amount of this work is going to be done by the civil side, the private sector. And if they're not incentivized in some way, like the fear of God, or the wrath of the people who are ratepayers or taxpayers, it is a distinct possibility, ladies and gentlemen, that we will not build into the next generation grid what we should. So that is our job, to make sure that they get that word and that they respond to it. Secondly, Avi mentioned this EMP Commission. This is a panel of distinguished physicists, other sorts of scientists, and people with considerable experience in the government. In fact, I sort of think of them as the last of the Mohicans in terms of people who are thoughtful, knowledgeable, and deeply experienced in the subject matter of nuclear weapons and warfare. And they've devoted, for, frankly, trivial compensation, years of their lives trying to understand our vulnerabilities in this area, document them, and lay out a series of recommendations, I mean dozens and dozens and dozens of recommendations of practical things that could be done to correct these problems. A thankless job, if ever there were one, because by and large their recommendations have been ignored. Ignored by the government, ignored by the Defense Department, somewhat less so, certainly not as much as it should, ignored by the Homeland Security Department, and ignored by the Congress. So much so that they had to do another report. This first one was back in, I think, 2004. This one came out last May. Updating, expanding, filling in blanks. And still very little has been done. Now, again, another piece of good news. As Avi may have mentioned, I was out for a bit, but two of the most senior members of the United States Congress with responsibility for Homeland Security seem to have gotten it. Senator Joe Lieberman and Congressman Benny Thompson, respectively the chairman of the Senate and the House Homeland Security Committees. And there's some evidence that they might just actually be inclined to take the sort of step that I talked about a moment ago. And perhaps even to ensure that the Electromagnetic Pulse Threat Commission is reauthorized. and given the responsibility of just bird-dogging this problem and making sure that people understand that the threat is real and not going away, the vulnerabilities have to be fixed, and documenting where that's being done and where it's not being done. So there's a second action item. We need to support Senator Lieberman and Congressman Thompson in doing just that, getting this commission back up to speed and making sure that the checklist, the to-do list that it's given all of us, is actually getting to done. Okay? The third thing is something we frankly just haven't thought about in a frightfully long time. In fact, for most of the past 20, 30, 40 years, it's been considered, I don't know, so retro to think about civil defense. The idea that the United States government and state and local governments and we ourselves as individuals have a responsibility to attend to the very practical idea that we can survive some very bad things with a modicum of preparation. And this is a particularly hard problem because, as Avi and Spider have said, it doesn't go away quickly. But thinking about preparations for stockpiling food, stockpiling water, providing shelter, encouraging people to understand how they can do that in their homes, can at least enhance the probability of survival of some of the problems that are not as vexing, not as debilitating as this, and even give us some better prospect of surviving as a society this problem, especially if we've taken some of the other steps that I've mentioned. So civil defense, again, is something that if you want it, you will find your elected representatives responding to your demand. If you choose to continue to ignore the very real possibility that it may be the difference between your survival and that of your family, at least against certain kinds of things that could go very badly around here, you will continue to assure that we do not have, as a practical matter, any kind of robustness built into our society. Now, it happens that all of those three things are going to be a real help if it's not Kim Jong-il or Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, but it's Mother Nature that is whacking us in this way. So even if you choose to discount, and I don't think you'd be here if you did, but let's just say you choose to discount the possibility that one or the other of these very psychopathic people decide to try to bring about a world without America. Perhaps not by stupidly launching a missile at us from, say, the Korean Peninsula or Iran, but from a ship off of our coast. The scenario that the EMP Commission most worried about, one that could use a short-range missile, one that could use a tramp steamer, one that could put a missile-delivered weapon over our country with essentially no notice and no fingerprints. Let's just say that's not something we're going to worry about. Well, if you know, as a matter of science, that in 2 or 3 years' time, we're going to be blasted by solar flaring, unlike anything we've seen in 150. That ought to be enough to get our attention. And each of those things, hardening the upgraded grid, implementing the decisions of the EMP Commission, and providing at least an enhanced level of civil defense will help. Then there are a couple of things that would be especially useful if we're dealing with the psychopaths and not Mother Nature. Actually, this one will be both, too. I think this is another one of those things we're really not supposed to talk about in polite company. But you're here because you're prepared, I think, to probably be impolite, or at least be informed. And if you're informed, sometimes that prompts you to be a little bit more. One of the things that has contributed to our perilous state on all of this EMP business and the vulnerability that flows from it is that about 1992, we as a nation stopped worrying about nuclear threats. Oh, I don't mean in a sort of generic sense, proliferation. I mean the actual practical problem of nuclear war. It's contributed to that civil defense issue. It's contributed to the fact that, you know, even the military, in spite of what we agree with this, even the military doesn't have the kind of resiliency against the threat that it once did. Partly because we've stopped testing nuclear weapons, or among other reasons, the purpose of evaluating these vulnerabilities. Partly it's also because something we've done is a very practical step in this sort of post-Cold War world, namely figuring out how to affect economies and maximize the bang for the buck, if you will, of our investment in defense by using something called commercial off-the-shelf technology, COTS. And the problem with COTS is, as I said a moment ago, the civilian side of the economy has never troubled itself to think about this problem. It's an additional expense. It's an impediment to the fast, innovative turnaround of more and more capable technology. We've built into the military, to the extent that we have increasingly utilized commercial off-the-shelf technology, the vulnerabilities inherent in that civilian economy. And we don't really even know, because we don't do the kind of testing we did in the past, how acute it is, even for the military. So I suggest to you that testing, serious testing, including underground nuclear testing, is something that ought to be part of the mix. I'm sure I was horrified because he's just trying to work this problem, and here I am making it harder. But I think we need to be realistic. The North Koreans are doing nuclear tests. You can bet the Russians are doing covert nuclear tests. Chinese. The Iranians will in due course. This is something we had better be thinking about and understanding what they're doing, as well as what our vulnerabilities are. Finally, missile defense. Again, won't keep solar flares from happening, but it can stop ballistic missiles from delivering nuclear weapons to the areas over this country. I couldn't agree more with both of the previous speakers. By the way, Avi, I don't know if you mentioned this, but he's spent most of his adult life working on missile defense, first in this country and now in Israel. We owe him a great debt of gratitude for the work that he's done, because thanks to people like him, and thanks to George Bush, we have at least a modest missile defense today. And as it happens, that'll be a good thing, because it may just be that for the 4th of July, Kim Jong-il sends a missile towards Hawaii. But not to worry. President Obama has assured us all the T's are crossed and all the I's are dotted. Not sure what that means exactly, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't mean we have the missile defense in place that we would want, because among other things, it's cunning, as Spider has pointed out. In fact, specifically, he's cut long-range missile interceptors, second airborne laser, which is what you want to hit these missiles as they're beginning their ascent, long distances, and is foreclosed probably permanently any kind of space-based missile defense, which is really the optimal way to defend this country.
of a strategic and very dangerous kind. And with the hope that that has given you some sense that you don't actually need to kill yourself, or even just go home, but that you can go home and start doing some things that will help us ensure that this country, which we all love, will survive and prosper in the face of both these man-made disasters, as they like to say at the Department of Homeland Security, and the natural kind. And in so doing, bequeath to our kids a country that we know they deserve. Thank you.
General James Spider Marks. I'll let him explain how he got that nickname. He is a West Point graduate, and he served in the U.S. Army for over 30 years, attaining the rank of Major General. And he was the senior intelligence officer for the Joint Task Force Los Angeles during the LA riots. He was also the senior intel officer in the Balkans, Korea, and for Operation Iraqi Freedom. He was the Commander General of the U.S. Army Intelligence Center and is an honor graduate of the U.S. Army Rangers School, a master parachutist, and the recipient of the Distinguished Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, and the Bronze Star. And just to put those medals into some kind of perspective, those are the 3rd, 4th, and 6th highest honors, respectively, that a member of our military can achieve. General Marks.
Thank you very much. I am indeed honored to be with you this evening. Thank you very much for that warm welcome. In our 32 years of marriage, my bride, all in a row, we moved probably 20 times when I was in uniform. We have a bunch of kids, and so they all went to different high schools. Each of them went to 3 different high schools. And so routinely in our house, we had boxes that just didn't get unpacked. You know, you got to your new house and you kind of set stuff up. You got them in the right location, but in many cases you just didn't get the socks unpacked and you lived out of a box a little bit. We did our best to not do that and encourage getting settled. But in many cases we often didn't. One day my wife said, she asked me, one of my girls asked me if I'd go find something in the closet. So I was in the closet and I opened one of my wife's shoe boxes. And I opened up the shoe box, and I was kind of shocked. I looked, there were 3 eggs in a shoe box, and a roll of money. I mean, just like ones and hundreds all wrapped up, you know. And it's a shoe, and amongst all these boxes. I said, what is this? I'm really kind of shocked, you know. So I grabbed my bride, and I said, hey, Marty, you know, one of our girls asked us, you know, so I was wandering through the closet. I found this box. Now I'm kind of on the thin ice. You know, like, what is it? Where's this going? I said, honey, what's with the shoe box? And she said, oh, did you find the box with the eggs? I said, yes, ma'am, I did. She said, well, you know, you give a lot of public speaking. You know, you do a lot of public speaking, and you talk to a lot of groups. And every time, and in our 32 years of marriage, every time you give a speech and you blow it, I stick an egg in the box. So I'm not feeling too bad. 3 eggs, 32 years, this ain't bad. And she said, yeah, but you know what the money's for? And I said, no. She said, every time I got a dozen, I sold them. So, I'll try not to lay an egg. That's where that comes from. Avi gave you the science of EMP, and I got to tell you, that was absolutely gripping. There's an incredible amount of work that we need to do, and it all can be done. My charge tonight is I want to kind of lay out for you the landscape of some of the bad guys that are out there, those nuclear-capable nations, and what I think their intentions are, and talk a little bit about what I think is a mismatch in our DoD budget and our strategy. And so you keep that presentation in mind, and then you look at what we're doing about it and who's out there and it makes you want to go home a little quicker also. First of all, let me talk about national missile defense. It's not the SDI that we all knew 20 plus years ago when the great President Reagan had a tremendous vision on how to protect us. It is a much more watered down version of that, and in fact it is specifically, if I can kind of use a few very specific words, it's limited to counter a relatively small ICBM attack from a less sophisticated adversary. If you're nuclear capable, I don't think you're less sophisticated. But that's kind of the definition that we're dealing with. Currently, it's primarily ground-based. You've got the radar array that's established in Alaska, in Fort Greely. That's been in place a few years. Again, there are 3 phases to it. Phase 1 is very limited attack, and it gets more complex and more integrated in terms of our ability to respond going through, but those aren't in place yet. Then you have to look at the budget in terms of how national missile defense is being handled, and it isn't being handled appropriately. I think our strategy, our DoD strategy right now, there's a tremendous mismatch in terms of what I would call strategy, size of the military, and modernization. I won't get into all of those, but the bottom line is that the dollars don't match the strategy. So the desired ends are not being funded by the required means. For example, the Army is committed in 2 wars in Southwest Asia. And the strategy is that we are committed there, and there is no additional land power available in the United States to commit elsewhere. So we're going to have to hold, if there's a fight someplace else, with the Navy and the Air Force. Yet you look at their budgets for the Joint Strike Fighter, for national missile defense, for the F-22, for littoral ships, and it again doesn't match the strategy. So we're saying one thing and we're doing something entirely different, which causes great concern. And certainly I'm biased as an Army guy. We've got to increase the top line of the military, of the Army, very specifically, if we're going to meet these requirements that are extant right now and those that we think are out there. Another big issue that doesn't get addressed and wasn't addressed with the creation of Homeland Security, the Department of Homeland Security, is the lack of coordination that exists between DoD and DHS. It simply doesn't exist. And let me describe it in very personal terms. I was the commanding general down at Fort Huachuca. Fort Huachuca is south of Tucson. It's about 5 miles north of Mexico in the Huachuca Mountains. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's also a historic trade route, and routinely illegal aliens would walk through out of the Huachuca Mountains, walk through Fort Huachuca. We would arrest them, and 2 weeks later they would come back. It was catch and release, is what it was. And that was the policy, catch and release. I'll tell you a story afterwards about when I literally was back from Iraq 48 hours. I'd gone to war and I came back home to resume my duties, and I had 6 illegal aliens in my front yard. It was kind of a one-way conversation. But I can talk about that later. But my point is that we created training at Fort Huachuca knowing that the threat from the south, whether it's illegal aliens from Mexico or Central America, South America, or Chinese, which we grabbed a few, or other forms of potential bad guys, which we grabbed a few, there was plenty of opportunity for us to see that and witness that and train against that. So I turned all of our radars and all of our sensing devices in the direction of Mexico. And I was allowed to do that because I wasn't stepping across the border. I was shooting electrons across the border, so to speak. But what we had to do was create a fusion center where the FBI office from in town, and we had the largest FBI office outside of Chicago. FBI office in town, Border Patrol, state police, local police. We created a fusion center, and because of posse comitatus, there were limits to what I, as a uniformed officer, and my guys could do. So we created this fusion center, and we produced products, and we'd turn them over to the local law enforcement or the FBI, and they'd decide how they wanted to do it. That was a lesson that I learned here in the great city of Los Angeles back in '92 as the senior intel guy. There was no coordination with Homeland Security and DoD. It just happened because we locally decided to make that happen. I'm very concerned nationally that there are incredible gaps that are expanding every day that aren't being addressed. Phil Mudd. Phil Mudd was a deputy director of the Counterterrorism Center, was a CIA professional, was just nominated to be the director of intelligence for Homeland Security. He withdrew his nomination. He was dropped by the administration. I'm concerned about this administration. This is one of the most professional individuals. I know him. He would have done a magnificent job, and because of his connections to the previous administration, he now is not worthy or capable of doing the job. What a terrible mistake. Again, that gap gets wider when those kinds of activities are allowed to occur. Local law enforcement. Let me talk about that just for a sec. There are a number of programs called intelligence-led policing, where instead of just casting a very broad net, you in fact go after, and you go after bad guys and you protect good guys. Sounds very much like our counterinsurgency doctrine. And it's working, but it's not gaining momentum. I'm very fortunate. Tomorrow morning I get a chance to link up with Chief Bratton. I will talk about this session this evening. And there are a number of other things that we're going to talk about, and one of those is intelligence-led policing. He really is at the forefront of that. He really created some incredible programs in New York City before he came out to LA. But let's be frank. Let's be frank. Not every act is preventable. Obviously, you'd think more soldiers on the ground, you're going to get a better sense of the environment. More police on the ground, you're going to understand what your neighborhoods look like. But there are not sufficient leading indicators in all cases to completely prevent activities and acts that we want to stay away from. So I go to obvious point, which is redundancy, hardening, resiliency. We have to acknowledge that in many cases our detection is just not going to work. In the case of EMP, it better work. But there are things that we can do now in parallel to ensure that if we get it wrong, at least we've got some ability to take a blow and recover and not go into complete darkness like we described. So, having said that, let me walk through some of the bad guy threats. But before I do that, let me walk through when Avi talked about the infrastructure that we have here in the United States. Let me lay out some statistics for you, if I can, please. The macro numbers really are kind of huge. There are, by definition, 87,000 communities in the United States, 1,800 federal reservoirs, 2,800 power plants, 104 commercial nuke power plants, 5,000 airports, 120,000 miles of railroad, 590,000 bridges, and 2 million miles of pipeline, 80,000 dams. So, in terms of infrastructure, just pure infrastructure, look what we're losing the ability to employ, to have access to, if we allow this to occur. And then, interestingly, 85% of that, what I just described for you, is privately held. There are some things that we can sacrifice. Frankly, we have to decide where we think those are. Otherwise, we lose it all. We stand to lose it all. Let me talk about some of the bad guys. Russia, our newest friend. Russia demonstrated last summer its near abroad desires. We have to assume that Russia is recidivist fundamentally in its behavior, and that it will, in fact, maintain its arsenal, and it has intentions, and we have to assume that it has intentions, and understanding that the definition of the threat is capability plus intentions. So we can sense and we can feel and we can see what capabilities are. It is another thing entirely to figure out what those intentions are. We have to work exceptionally hard in the case of Russia to make sure that we understand that. China. We have a growing relationship with China, but that is a major power in the Pacific. It is always, for the last 3 decades, it's been the decade of the Pacific. It really has been. I was a young captain serving in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, and we were talking about China and its threat capabilities then. It exists in spades. And how aggressively are we maintaining our relationships there? Are we, in fact, sensing what it is they are trying to do and what they're trying to achieve? They're very open about it. We're busy elsewhere, so we're crossing our fingers that that's not going to be a problem. And that's kind of the purpose of tonight's event. North Korea. I was a senior intel guy in Korea. I had the the great pleasure of staying awake for a year and a half. It was a 20-second flight from one of the ADITs in North Korea for a shell to land in Seoul and kill my family. And my family was there with me. So needless to say, that was an exciting year and a half. That is as unusual and strange a regime as you can ever imagine. I really can't put it in a box. I do believe that they are very difficult to predict. They can be read, and we have to assume that the intentions of that regime are not, we are not going to get our arms around them in any significant way anytime soon. So the best way you work the problem in North Korea is from the outside in, and that's kind of been the way that we've approached it for many years. Which really brings me to the next one is Pakistan. When you talk about challenges in Pakistan, let me throw Afghanistan in there only because of the significance of where we have such a large focus right now. Pakistan, again, the strategy in Pakistan has to be from the outside in. We have got to be able to understand how it fits and how its neighbors view Pakistan. That is as volatile as it gets. It is a country that is on the brink, and democracy potentially could be lost tomorrow. And it has, as you well know, a very vibrant terrorist capability and a very vibrant and robust nuclear capability as well. India remains a hugely unstable nation, primarily in its relationships with Pakistan. Our relationships have improved immensely post 9/11. It took a step back last fall, as you well know. But again, how we balance those two, both India and Pakistan, and what their desires are, if we don't really get into the details on a routine basis, then any small changes we lose, we miss, and we stand to have significant problems as we go down the road. And then our favorite nation, Iran. Persia, Shia Persia, has problems that go beyond what you see in the press right now. Let me make another statement about our administration that really concerns me. When the primary means for decision making in Washington is as a result of Twitter tweets from unvalidated source in Tehran, I've got problems with that. Now, I understand the nature of the internet and all means of communications, but I also understand you can have two idiots talking to each other on the phone. That doesn't mean the technology is wonderful. I still have two idiots. I want to make sure that we've got to be able to have an understanding of that environment, and we're not doing it right now. We're not doing it right now. We're relying on something that I find almost criminal, frankly. The Sunni Arabs are going to rally against Iran. But they are. I mean, they already are. So there's a sense of there's a governor that exists in place, but their capabilities, again, as described by Avi, are quite frightening, and technologically, Iran is a very modern and a very robust nation. My brother-in-law, married to my wife's sister, is Iranian, goes back to Tehran all the time. His views are quite interesting. He doesn't see this as a problem. He doesn't live in Tehran. We've got a major issue on our hands, and they will be nuclear. There's nothing that I see right now that indicates that they're not going to be nuclear, and that concerns me greatly again. Those are my prepared remarks, somewhat rambling, but let me tell you, I would like to spend some time answering questions, if you'd like to, on a whole host of issues relevant to this, and then anything else. I can certainly talk to you about interrogations that I was a part of in Iraq, of some pretty key guys, and I can walk you through some of those details as well. But thank you very much for your attention.
Schnurr has worked on addressing missile threats and missile defense policies for over 2 decades. He has reviewed U.S. technology both for the Department of Defense and the White House Homeland Security Council, and has managed international defense programs. He, as Doris mentioned, he's the president of MPAC, the EMP Awareness Coordination Task Force, and the executive director of the Israel Missile Defense Association. Avi Schnurr, and I hope he does better with the mic than I did.
Listen, thank you very much, Janet. I think your remarks in a very, very few minutes have summarized what is certainly a very devastating issue. Before I begin, I just wanted to thank Doris Wise, the Children of Holocaust Survivors, David Horowitz Freedom Center. It's an honor to be here with Frank Gaffney, with General Marks. So, and I'm honored also that all of you came tonight. I'd like to go fairly quickly, and the plan for the evening is each of us will go through, we'll give a fairly short presentation. Mine will be just a bit longer because it is an overview, because we want to have time for questions. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. This portion of the presentation I titled Missile Crisis 2009, Existential Threats to the U.S. and its Allies. You know, I never really expected to be giving a presentation with a title like this. I'm living in Israel, and we've gotten used to the idea in Israel that we talk about existential threats, by which people mean threats to the continued existence of the State of Israel. That's a scary idea. But since the end of the Cold War, people have not been talking about that in the context of the United States. Unfortunately, what we're going to discuss this evening is the fact that the United States, Israel, and its allies are remarkably in the same boat. I think to begin, what I'd like to do is just say a few words about what is EMP. Incidentally, maybe we do need a little bit of light because I'm afraid people
want to take notes.
It's a pretty bright projector, and people probably want to be able to see the body language. So,
Or they want to take notes.
yeah, a little more. No, I would say maybe in the back, lighting in the back. Yeah. Thanks. I don't know about the other speakers, but I have trouble speaking without moving my hands. If you can't see it, I won't know if you're hearing me. Okay, so let me say a few words about what is EMP. As I said, I'll try to go quickly, but keep track of your questions. Okay. Can you still hear me? Yes. Okay. That was exciting. What is EMP? So EMP, to be a little bit technical, it's a sudden intense pulse of electromagnetic energy that can shut down a continent, shut down all of the electrical infrastructures of a continent. What does that really mean? I tried to think of how to express this in a more graphic way. Think of a nuclear bomb going off above the Earth's ionosphere out in space, a massive, tremendous explosion. It hits the Earth's ionosphere like hitting it with an electric hammer. The ionosphere rings. When it rings, it sends the electronic equivalent of a sound incredibly loud to the ground, and that wipes out electronics. We're talking about 10,000, 20,000 volts per meter. Much, much faster hitting and much more powerful than lightning. That's what it is. Now, I talked about a nuclear bomb going off in space. It would have to be in space above the atmosphere to have this effect. That's one way you can have this problem. There is another possible cause of essentially the same kind of effect, and that would be a massive solar storm. I'll talk a little bit about that later, but it's important to keep this in mind. Tonight, we're not simply and only talking about military threats. That's the most immediate issue that we're addressing tonight. But we're also going to be talking about something that could happen from Mother Nature. And finally, what are the effects? So Janet talked about this, and I'm going to go into more detail. But we're talking about something that destroys not only the electric grid that runs all of our provides all our power, but also water, telephones, transportation, financial, food delivery systems, and I'll get more specific, and I think some of the other speakers are also going to talk about this. But just think for a moment, if a disaster suddenly struck tonight, do you know where your other family members are? Do you know where your children are? How would you get in touch with them? All of the normal means that we've come to know and use and depend on would not be there. And that, unfortunately, is just the beginning. Now, what I wanted to cover first is to talk a little bit about history, because to understand what this is, and especially to understand why it makes sense, why we're talking about something which is real, I think understanding history is critical. So let me talk about that for a minute. And the context, I think, when you first encounter this, it sounds like, something out of science fiction, maybe a George Lucas movie. It just doesn't sound credible. It doesn't sound real. So it is real. It's more than credible. Let me try very, very quickly to summarize the history, and I think it'll give you a sense for that. Back in 1962, the United States completed its first successful upper atmosphere nuclear test. This test was called Starfish Prime. It took place in the middle of the Pacific, not close to anything, 800 miles away from Hawaii. The test went more or less as planned. Everybody was very pleased with the results. There was one surprise. 800 miles away, streetlights in Hawaii went out. Radio stopped working. Electric lines were fused. This was a surprise. 800 miles away. That was the beginning of a major change in the Cold War. Let's talk about that change for a minute. What very quickly happened is both the United States and the Soviet Union began to realize this is the key, the way to destroy the other side's ability to respond. If either side could launch a successful EMP attack, the other side wouldn't even have the communication or command and control to launch its missiles. This became step one in any major nuclear exchange. Now, at the time, nothing was done about the consequences for civilians, for you and I, for people living throughout the country. It would have been just as devastating, well, not just as devastating because we didn't have computer chips so integrated into our lives, but it would have been extremely difficult to deal with. But of course, in those days, we depended only on deterrent, mutually assured destruction. So that brings us up to the Cold War, and that became the plan for any nuclear exchange. Now let's move up a little bit closer in history, and let me talk for a minute about the day the world almost ended. Now, what I'm going to tell you is a story. You can get probably most of this online on the internet. I'm going to give you some additional details that came from the staff of a EMP commission established by Congress back about 8 or 9 years ago to explore this whole subject. So a historian attached to that commission provided some additional details. So there are not many people who have heard this story in this level of detail. The time is 1985. That's after the end of the Cold War. Sorry, 1995. Thank you. Somebody's reading my views. 1995, after the end of the Cold War. Norway decided they wanted to launch a weather instrument package into space. They asked NASA if they could borrow a launcher. NASA gave them a decommissioned nuclear booster. Unfortunately, that probably in retrospect wasn't such a good idea, but it should have worked out because Norway did what they were supposed to do. They notified all the countries in the area, of course including Russia. In Russia at the time, the equivalent of the US president's nuclear football, there are 3 of them. The Prime Minister the defense minister, and I believe also the interior minister, all can launch 1,000 nuclear warheads independently. Luckily, that day, all three of them were in a meeting together. The person in the Russian Defense Department who was supposed to take this information and transmit it upward, classic Hollywood story, he was sick. His replacement did not understand the procedure. Word never went up. At a certain point in the launch, people ran in. Yeltsin, the defense minister, the interior minister were there. They gave him the information. The defense minister turned to Yeltsin and he shouted at him, "Do it! Do it now! This is it! It's coming at us from the North Sea! This is our scenario!" Yeltsin opened his box. He was ready to pull the switch. And of course, he didn't do it. The next day, he gave a presentation to some factory that was beating swords into plowshares, converting missile parts to microwaves, something. He was still obviously shaken, and he said, "Yesterday I almost started World War III, and it was the fault of the United States." No, it's always the fault of the United States. The key when I first heard this story is this, to me, this made no sense. Why would Russia even consider launching 1,000 nuclear warheads when one missile is still on its way up? They haven't even seen it come down. It obviously wasn't pointed directly at Russia. It was too early in the launch for them to be able to know the details of the trajectory. Why take that risk? Why do it? After all, it's only one missile, even if it landed. Well, the answer, of course, is they were afraid it was an EMP attack. And an EMP attack, the missile doesn't come down. It goes up, we go down. With an EMP attack, you don't have to re-enter the atmosphere. You don't even have to get it that close to your country if it's a high enough missile. That's what they were afraid of. Fear of an EMP attack almost destroyed us in 1995. So, credibility, I think there is no question. It's worth commenting just for a moment that throughout the Cold War, both Russia and the United States had extensive professional people, had whole departments who did nothing other than EMP testing, making sure that we understood the phenomenology, how it works, how we could defend against it. This is a very, very well-anchored subject. Now, what I'd like to do is move on now and talk just very, very briefly about the nuclear threats that are out there, but only one specific element of this story, and General Marks is going to go into more detail. There are several countries that we have to worry about, but I just did want to highlight this one fact. Now, this fact came from the report of the Congressional Commission that was established to take a look at EMP and what it means. What they said is that about 4 years ago now, Iran launched a missile, did a missile test from the Caspian Sea, from a barge on the Caspian Sea. This is already a little bit mysterious. They do plenty of land-based tests. Why launch from the sea? The other thing that was very odd about that test is it exploded at apogee. It exploded at its peak altitude. People said, well, obviously this test is a failure. What the EMP Commission said is, it looks to them like this is a test of precisely the scenario that people worry about most in an attack on the United States of this kind. Meaning, launch from a barge, launch from a ship, off of one of the coasts, or off of both of the coasts, launched going up high over the western United States or eastern United States, and then exploding at apogee. The other fact that was brought out by the EMP Commission, if you go to Iran, if you go, for that matter, to North Korea, and you compare just the knowledge of the general public to other countries about EMP, if you go to a person on the streets here and say, do you know what EMP is? They'll probably assume you're asking about some new TV show, something. If you go to Iran and you ask that question, or you go to North Korea, very likely people will understand exactly what you're talking about. These countries, according to that commission, are among the countries where this awareness of this threat is the highest in the world, and it was even discussed in an Iranian military journal. What the journal said, if the world's industrial countries fail to defend themselves against electronic assaults, they will disintegrate within a few years. And the article went on to discuss what was an EMP attack. So General Marks will go into details, but this is a serious issue. If you look out there and you find that there are enemies of the United States, enemies of Israel, enemies of all of our allies, who would like to take us down, who are very close to having a single weapon, one bullet, which could destroy the entire country, that's a problem. That's a big problem. And therefore, of all of the threats that the United States has ever faced, there are a growing number of people, think tanks, some represented here tonight across the country, and for the first time now we're starting to see some legislative initiatives in Congress. People are starting to be seriously worried about this. Now, there's one other aspect of this which needs to be raised. And I mentioned this on the first slide, but let me reiterate it now. There are certainly people out there who feel that, I don't know about people here tonight, but basically everybody out there is sort of nice. Maybe they don't understand us totally, but they don't really want to do us that much harm, and at the end of the day, no one really do anything very horrible. Now, I don't know, personally, being a student of history, recent and less recent, I don't subscribe to that philosophy, but for those who do, for those of you who have friends who do, NASA last year funded a study done by the National Academy of Sciences. As people became increasingly concerned about the EMP threat, the concerns raised by NASA were, look, now that we understand we're very vulnerable to this kind of a problem, let's take a look at the history. How often would we experience the same kind of thing from the sun? What they found is that a major solar storm would have essentially the same kind of effect. And in fact, when they looked historically, what they found was in 1859, an effect very much like this occurred all over the world. There was a massive solar storm. Richard Carrington, a British astronomer, looked at the sun, observed sunspots bigger than anything he'd ever seen. The aurora borealis, normally only seen on the North Pole, the South Pole, the aurora borealis extended all the way to the equator and was more brilliant than anyone had ever seen it. The only electronics that existed in the world were the telegraph system, and the telegraph was wiped out all over the world. The effect lasted 8 days. The National Academy of Sciences concluded, based on their analysis of solar cycles, of history, we should expect an effect like this about once in 100 years. Folks, it's been 150 years. One last comment. If you look at the, incidentally, before I get to the last comment, another conclusion of the National Academy of Sciences, a severe storm, a storm of the type that we had in 1859, would destroy all 300 of the big $50 million class transformers that control the U.S.'s electric grid in about 90 seconds. So I wanted to end with a weather report. On the surface of the sun, I'm happy to report the weather is calm, everything is fine. The next major peak in solar activity is expected in 2012. The sun goes through a 10 to 12 year cycle. We don't know at which peak we will experience the next major solar storm. If it happens in 2012, that means we've got around 2 years to get ready. Incidentally, if you read the report of the National Academy of Sciences, it's remarkable. You know, I used to be a scientist at one point in my life. And I can tell you Scientists are very, very cautious. They're careful. They never exaggerate. They always try to underplay their conclusions. You read that report, it's astonishing. It reads like a science fiction novel. These are scientists who are more than worried. Okay, so let me move on now, talk about EMP effects. What you see up here is a one-line summary of a 70-page executive summary of the Congressional EMP Commission. You know, maybe it's worth just a couple minutes to talk about how that commission came into being, because I think it's instructive. This was back in, I believe it was the year 2000. The United States and Russia were having a little bit of a problem working together, dealing with some of the things going on in Eastern Europe. So a delegation came from Congress to Russia, met together with representatives of the Duma. The meeting did not go well. It didn't go well at all. By the end of the meeting, the head of the Duma, who was there, stood up, got very angry, and said, "Listen, you better pay attention to us, because if you don't, with one EMP bomb, we could destroy your country." When the congressional delegation came back to Washington, they decided to set up the EMP Commission. I'm sure there was no relationship whatsoever with the warning they received. It seemed like the right thing to do at the time. But in any case, the EMP Commission concluded that we are facing catastrophic dangers to our society. And by catastrophic, they're talking about something worse than any threat the United States has ever faced. So let me be specific. First of all, the most serious issue is the national electric grid goes down. It's a blackout. It's not the kind of blackout that we're used to, where, okay, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour. In New York, it was 12 hours on one occasion. This is a blackout that does not end. It's permanent. The electricity will never, ever come back. The 300 big $50 million class transformers that distribute power are fused. The electrical wiring is melted. They have to be replaced. The United States has about 3 or 4 of these transformers spares. That's it. New ones are not made in the United States. There's only one country in the world, as it happens, that makes them. One company in South Korea. So we would get in line. This is a serious problem. It's a very serious problem. We cannot wait until after an event like this happens, because how do you recover from something like that? The situation is grim. It gets worse. If you read the 70-page summary of the EMP Commission, it's quite remarkable. If Hollywood gets a hold of this, I'm sure they'll make an amazing disaster movie out of it. But you're talking about destroying power plants. Power plants, oil refineries, all use distributed electronic control systems, which will be the very first thing to go. That means the power plants are exploding. That means the refineries are going up in smoke. Not to imagine what this could mean for nuclear power plants. For environmentalists out there, this is the worst possible environmental disaster anyone has ever conceived. Janet mentioned at the beginning that water and power fail. What this means is when you go to your tap to turn on the water, nothing is going to come out. And it's not going to ever come out again, at least until somehow we could put it all back together. And if we've done nothing whatsoever to prepare before something like this happens, it's more than difficult to imagine how we could get it back together. So no water, phones won't work, most cars and trucks will not operate. And since most cars and trucks won't operate, that means that all of the kinds of economic activity that depends on trucks also will not operate. All the computer-based data networks are down, the banks are down, businesses will be unable to function. There will be no food. The United States has a 3-day on-demand food supply. If you look at what's available in the stores, in the warehouses, it's about a 3-day supply. Now, the U.S. does have by law an emergency food supply for the nation. When the EMP Commission asked for testimony from all of the different agencies, including FEMA, including the emergency supply agencies, what they found is that the current status of the emergency food supply is that it has enough wheat to supply every American with about half a loaf of bread. So, you know, they say half a loaf is better than none. So, okay. There's not going to be any food. Probably the people best off will be us here in California because we all have earthquake supplies. But this is the most serious issue. Number one, the electricity goes down, that shuts everything off. Number two, no more water supply. Number three, no more food. We're back, as Janet said, to about an 1850s class economy and industry. And in 1850, the United States was able to support a population of 30 million people. So, that was the bad news. This is the good news. And I know that Frank is going to talk about this more. I will just touch on this subject very briefly. Correction is feasible. We can deal with this. We have to deal with this. It's essential. You know, I think the global perspective here is very important. And let me just say this. If you look at history and you try to ask yourself, how often has the United States or any of our allies ever faced a major crisis where we had a pretty good idea it was coming, it was predicted, and successfully dealt with it before the crisis hit? Can anyone think of examples? I haven't thought of any. I asked the historian who works for the EMP Commission. He had none. This time, for the first time, we've got to get it right. We have to deal with this before it hits, because normally what happens is, you know, it's not the best plan in the world to let crisis hit and then recover, but at least, you know, it gives you a lot of energy to deal with the crisis and then you recover. Not ideal, but it works poorly, but it works. This time it won't work. We must get it right. We must get it right. This is no joke. I mean, I'm sitting here and giving you a nice PowerPoint presentation. It seems like any other presentation. This is not like anything else. This is the worst problem we've ever faced. And if we can't find a way to get the U.S. government to act on this expeditiously, we're going down. If somehow all our enemies go away, none of them realize that with a single weapon they could wipe us out totally. I mean, I don't know, General Marks, I'd be interested in your opinion, but my sense is that's unlikely to happen. Even if it does, if NASA is right, we're overdue for a similar effect from the sun. We have never before been in the position, the human race has never been in the position of all of our lives being dependent on these tiny, tiny, delicate little microchips which now control everything. That's where we are, and absolutely nothing has been done, except to some extent in the military, to harden them. Nothing. That's what we're facing, and that's what we have to do. So what can be done? I will hit a few highlights. I won't go into detail. You know, there are two levels. There's missile defense, which is absolutely essential. Before we get to missile defense, the most absolutely critical thing, depending on how much money we can put together from Congress, is to just do the job of defending, of protecting our basic infrastructures. Most of you probably have surge protectors on your computers at home. What do you think about a surge protector on America? Does that sound like a good idea? This should be the first priority. This is a no-brainer. You know, I have spent about 2 weeks in Congress. I spent a full day in Congress hosted by Frank. And most of the people we talked to, most of the congressional staffers, the senators, the congressmen, for them, not all, but most, this was new. This was a new subject. This must change. And you can all help it change. The pictures here are there to translate what could look like a sort of a technical presentation into reality. You know, we've got to do this. Why? The picture on the bottom represents healthcare. There will be no healthcare. Hospitals have emergency generators that will have enough fuel to run 2 or 3 days, and that's all. Telephones, business, food, all of these are the first things that we will notice when they go down. We're not talking about a lot of money. The EMP Commission's conclusions, we're talking a few $1 billion a year to do everything that has to be done. In comparison with the stimulus package, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that these days that's sort of pocket change. You know, the money should be there. That's not the issue. Obviously, we need to get busy. I'm here representing MPACT, which is a new organization which is working to pull together a lot of think tanks, a lot of government representatives, and a number of different countries. I will be in Europe next week. I'll be in India the following week. We're trying to move all of the Western world together to start focusing on the fact that we must do something. It's going to take a lot more energy than all of us have been able to put into it in the past. With Frank's help, there was a lot of government consulting that has been going on over the last few weeks in Congress. We're starting to talk to the police forces. I spoke with the deputy chief of the LAPD a couple of days ago. He's going to ask Chief Bratton if he could bring this up at the Major Cities Chiefs Conference. The police could get involved. Perhaps if the police talk to the Department of Homeland Security, maybe then they'll pay attention. All of these things must be done. Just so you know, if people would like to come up to me afterwards, I'll give you a card and you can send word to me. But I think Doris will also send out the information. There is the first EMP National Conference will be occurring in Buffalo, New York, right after Labor Day. You can get that information. You'll get it by email, or you can ask me afterwards. So there are plenty of things to be done. Obviously, getting in touch with the government. Frank is going to go into a lot more detail. I wanted to include this. This is a quote that was actually used by President Obama during his inaugural address. And, you know, I know he didn't mean it to apply to this. But the philosophy, the basic idea is as true as it ever was when Thomas Paine originally said it. Let it be said to the future world that in the depth of winter, when nothing but hope and virtue could survive, that the city and the country and every one of us, alarmed at one common danger, came forth to meet it. Let that happen.
Well, something I wanted to mention that was part of the EMP Commission report is they projected that 90% of Americans would be dead 1 year following an EMP attack. And as Avi mentioned, the food situation too, people are going to be so desperate for food that they may actually consume food in their refrigerators that's spoiled, get sick, dehydrated, there's no health care. No help on the way. I mean, there will be a lot of deaths. And actually, I hope one of the panelists speaks about this, but I had heard that the EMP Commission was disbanded. Is that true?
Yes, they're in the process of trying to be reestablished.
Okay.
We can talk about that in a few minutes. There are a number of different things that have to be done that should be done. The most critical and urgent thing is the grid itself. The grid has to be protected, and by protecting the grid, the most urgent aspect of that protection is to keep those $350 million huge transformers, to keep them operating. We don't want them to go down. We don't want all that wiring to melt, because it's almost impossible to come back if that happens. How do we do that? The most critical, most easiest and cheapest way to do it is to use a device, which is much like your circuit protector helmet. One of the things that the Congressional Commission did, the EMP Commission, is during their 8 years in operation, something which let's call but it's quite effective. You have to have something quite unique to do it, because an EMP strike, you would see a voltage, let's just say in simple terms, it hits about 10 times as fast as lightning, and it's a huge, huge pulse. So you can't use anything like a conventional surge protector, but the technology is now there. It was developed, it was tested. There's a little bit of additional testing the EMP Commission would like to do, but basically it is ready to go. That's the key, most essential thing. There are a host of other recommendations that would be subsidiary, but if you even do that, just that, it's a whole different world. The most devastating scenarios we've talked about are then, to a large extent, off the table.
I can take it from what I would call the, excuse me, the INW, the indications and warning aspects. There would be probably, I'm digging back into my experience, probably anywhere from 48 to 72 hours of prep that would be very, very discernible in terms of their launch capabilities and the fuels that they use in order to have a delivery system. So we would probably be able to pick that up. Clearly, we've been able to pick it up every time before, and the previous launches have either fallen right into the sea or jumped over Japan and then fell into the ocean. So once it gets into its flight, then we're into the missile defense capability that exists in its rudimentary stages. So I'm not optimistic.
Well, just to add to that, I think what would presumably happen is that a set of sensors would pick up the missile after it basically clears sort of curvature of the Earth. You would have a variety of missile defenses that theoretically could be brought to bear. The most likely, it would seem to me, of being able actually to do something about that missile would be missile defenses aboard Navy ships, known as the Aegis ships, or equipped ships. Famously, last year, a jury-rigged Aegis ship shot down a satellite that you may remember was deorbiting and potentially going to pose a threat to land masses, which was a pretty nifty feat, and Avi can tell you much more about the technical details than I, but I would just say that I think whether it is, depending on, again, the characteristics of the missile and where exactly it's going, you might get a shot at it with the land-based systems in the United States, but not very likely. You might get a shot at it with what I understand are advanced tactical or theater missile defenses that have been put on the island of Hawaii, so-called THAAD systems. But I think most likely, if it is going to be shot down, it would be done with one of these surface-based Navy missile defenses. But none of that will happen if it's not ordered by the Commander-in-Chief.
You know, there are two layers of defense that we're talking about tonight against any missile attack, but also against EMP. There's infrastructure hardening, which is critical if you're talking about EMP, and there's active missile defense. Israel has a deployed active missile defense system, the Arrow system. It's a very good system. We could talk about funding and long-term things. Let's not get into that now. That's a complex subject. But basically, in terms of active missile defense, Israel does have the advantage that there is an active missile defense deployed system. I think people who were here last time heard I gave a fairly in-depth presentation on a lot of issues and deficiencies that could really be corrected with Israel's total missile defense system. But so there is some capability there. It really depends on how the attack comes. And in a kind of an open session like this, there are some sensitive things that I just don't want to get into. But let me say this. If you're facing a direct attack, you know exactly what the damage of the attack would be. In this case, wiping out electrical infrastructures. Basically, people refer to an EMP attack as a country destroyer. The most critical, most essential thing that has to be done is to harden the infrastructure, harden the electric grid, harden all of the control systems that control water, control power. Israel, as we all know, depends in particular on communication because they don't have a large standing army. They depend on calling up the reserves. Think about what that would mean in the context of what I just talked about. Think about Israel's enemies and what they could do. So there is no country in the world, at least no Western country, that to date, as far as I know, has done very much to harden their infrastructures. That's true of the United States, it's true of Israel, it's true of all the Western democracies, it's true of China. That has not yet happened.
The question, I think, is what are the indicators? As an Intel guy, I'm into trying to read the picture, so you're into prevention as opposed to the forensics that follow the event. So it would be what are we able to pick up in terms of Iran's development, and then how far along in the development and the weaponization of the nuclear capabilities are they? And I won't get into diplomacy and whether that's working or not working. So the short answer is, do we have the technology? Sure, we have the technology. We've chosen not to use it since World War II, but I must say that the world is a heck of a lot safer place now after nukes than it was before nukes in terms of the devastation of warfare that occurred. So my point being is, I don't know what the real answer is. We're certainly not going to do that.
Well, let me just add a thought. The simple truth of the matter is that the more primitive, I guess is a word you could use, the more primitive is a society, the less the effect would be of an electromagnetic pulse attack. Now, there's certainly a lot of things that would be damaged in Iran from such an attack, much as there would be any place else where you have some, infrastructure that requires electricity and so on. But I just have to tell you, my strong feeling remains, and I don't know if this is shared in the room or not, but what we've demonstrated, or seen demonstrated, I should say, in the past couple of weeks is something I've believed for years. And that is that the problem with Iran is not the people of Iran. Some of them, yes, but not the masses of people in Iran. And I would so much rather see us help them fix this problem than inflict incalculable harm on them in what may or may not be a therapeutic effect on the regime that brutalizes them and threatens us. I haven't heard anybody say that it's got nuclear weapons on board. I think there's some speculation that it may have chemical weapons, perhaps parts of other kinds of weapons, maybe missiles. My personal assumption is that what they're doing, as the North Koreans typically do, and again, Spider spent a lot more time watching them up close than I have, but they're demonstrating that we are paper tigers. And not just we, but the UN, the international community. We threw down the gauntlet after that last nuclear test, after, I can't even remember how much fulmination at the UN, which finally spat out this set of new sanctions. And the North Koreans have promptly said, oh yeah? And they've taken this ship out for a spin, and they're seeing whether we're going to do anything about it. And I have to tell you, the irony of having the John S. McCain be the ship that has to go through this ignominy is too rich. I mean, you couldn't make that up.
There are some indications that more has been done in terms of hardening in Russia and China, indications that you can find in testimony to Congress that's out there on the internet, than anywhere else. So that may be true, it may not be true. I certainly haven't independently verified it. But certainly in the sort of among the U.S. and all of its allies, And even in the open literature, at least what's going on in China, there's no indication that anyone has really done much at all. The U.S. seems to be in the lead in that at least we've talked about it. At least we have established a Congressional EMP Commission. There's now a very detailed set of recommendations. Cost estimates have been made for those recommendations. We know what it'll cost, we know what it'll take, we know how much time it is. It's quite doable. Even after the first year, only a year of activity, the expectation is all the worst aspects of what we talked about tonight are off the table. So it's quite doable. The fact that we know that we can sit here talking about it, the fact that there was a Congressional Commission that took testimony from every relevant department of the U.S. government and the Pentagon is something unique, and that's a good thing. As unfortunate as it is that we haven't really taken any vigorous action, we are still, because we've at least thought about it, ahead of our allies.
Well, could I just respectfully challenge that somewhat rosy prognosis? My guess is, and I don't think any of us really know, maybe Spider's got still inside sources, but my guess is nobody really knows how seriously the Russians have taken the business of nuclear warfighting. But my guess is they've taken it a lot more seriously than we did during the Cold War, and certainly than we have since it ended. And just to give you one example, there are complexes for essentially the relocation of the entire leadership, dating back to the Soviet era, mind you, but continuously upgraded and expanded. Entire cities underground, connected by underground subways or special trains from the Kremlin to these facilities. Now, I'm not here to tell you that the Russians have hardened every aspect of their infrastructure. I doubt it. I suspect that what they continue to do, as they did during the Cold War, was prioritize the people who would survive a nuclear conflict. And that probably remains the case today. And I suspect the same is true of the Chinese. It is certainly true. I don't know if I was out of the room again. I don't know if you mentioned this, but one of the things that's an interesting telltale was when the EMP Commission first got started, one of the things, quite sensibly, they did was they went off to canvass what they could find out about what other people knew about this phenomenon. And one of the first places they went to, not surprisingly, was the old Soviet Union's nuclear weapons complex. And they asked to talk to people who might know something about EMP, and sure enough, they were told in the relatively open period of that day that there were a couple of guys who knew, all about this. I like to think of them as Fyodorov and Ivanov, but whatever their names were, those were sort of the duty guys for the USSR. Going back to the dates when they tested nuclear weapons and discovered EMP, they began systematically thinking about how to use it and to defend against it. So the commission, with great enthusiasm, said, well, we would love to talk to Fyodorov and Ivanov. And they were told, you can't. They're in North Korea. Now, this was a while ago. And the North Koreans are joined at the hip with the Iranians, so so how much have they done to counteract, as opposed to just putting themselves in a position to exploit EMP attacks? I don't know any more than maybe Avi or Spider does, but I think we should not take lightly the possibility that they've both thought about how to use it against us and how to minimize at least the impact on the things that they care about.
And I would say that the discussion, it can almost be like splitting hairs, but what Frank described very, very well is the hardening of the capability to deliver and to produce and to do research and development. In many cases, that might not be continuity of operations or continuity of government. But in many cases, such as the former Soviet Union, it was. So not only did you have the production capability, you also had the ability to protect those that were going to make the key decisions. In Iran, I think, I don't know, but I would guarantee you that if we were going to try to employ some bunker busting munitions against Iranian capabilities right now, we might find that we can't have much effect because they've hardened them and buried them so deeply. The North Koreans, from personal experience, North Koreans did that exceptionally well. And in fact, experience in the Balkans, every place the former Soviet Union went, they dug deep and they dug very broadly. Absolutely, Hezbollah as well. Absolutely. Having walked through some of those caves. It's quite amazing.
Well, you always have to follow the money. In the defense world, it's worth pointing out, again, that throughout the Cold War, Russia and the United States had big industries in defending weapon systems against an EMP attack, especially the strategic weapons, of course, but this was quite standard. During the period of the Cold War, and of course, as Frank said, after the Cold War, we began losing much of this with the use of commercial hardware within the military. But during the Cold War, very extensively, weapon systems had requirements that were associated with protection against EMP. So when you're a defense contractor, if that's part of your contract, you do it. If it's not part of your contract, you don't. So if the question is, why wouldn't the defense contractors look to try to use this as a new profit opportunity? It's a long shot unless Congress acts. Just not likely to be profitable unless there's a real need that comes from Congress.
There was an article that appeared in the New Republic on this about a month ago. I can't remember if you were specifically slimed. I was. It essentially tried to make the point that this is really just a scam. This is a way for knuckle-dragging cranks like us who want missile defenses to justify it having been discredited, as they put it, by our support for the liberation of Iraq and other post-9/11 activities. It was really interesting to me that the internal inconsistency of this author was so obvious in that even the people he quoted to lend credibility to that characterization of the likes of Avi and me and Spider acknowledged that this was a real threat. This is real, they said. It's just it's being used by these guys to do that. But I will tell you, the kind of opposition that you've seen on Capitol Hill is not of the, overt, above board, let's have an honest debate about this and we'll count up the votes and see who wins. It's been the kind of insidious backroom stuff that's resulted in the cashiering of the EMP Commission. Done by a Senate staffer, completely unaccountable, in a completely non-transparent committee action, and poof, it's gone. In the hopes now that it'll be rebuilt, but it's that sort of opposition that's been mostly behind the scenes. And Carl Levin, who is the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, is usually implicated in such skullduggery, either directly or by virtue of his staff.
One of the misunderstandings that people have is that it must take a lot of technology to do this EMP thing. It must be a very specialized bomb. Unfortunately, no. Any kind of a nuclear bomb is fine. The big thermonuclear fusion bombs have no more capability to do this kind of thing than a smaller fission bomb of the Hiroshima size. So anybody who can acquire a nuclear weapon can do it, assuming that he can deliver it with a missile, and that's critical. No, you could not do it from an aircraft. They're not high enough. To have this effect, you have to be at least at an altitude of 30 kilometers, which is way, way higher than any aircraft flies.
Could I just say, Janet, and I would defer to Avi on the technical points completely on this, but we should say that one of the things that is the stuff of a lot of Hollywood screenplays, as you may have noticed, is a more tactical use of electromagnetic pulse, or what are sometimes called radio frequency weapons. In fact, there's an Al-Qaeda magazine that was published recently, I think in North Carolina, explicitly, an Al-Qaeda magazine, which has an article about EMP grenades as a means of trying to neutralize the kind of communications and situational awareness, as they call it in the military, technologies that a fighter can attest to, we depend on so critically. The idea being, according to Al-Qaeda, this would level the playing field. Taking out the night vision goggles, taking out the computers, taking out the communications equipments and so on that make our forces so formidable against these ragtag guys. So Avi's absolutely right that the effect that we've been discussing all evening, the strategic, catastrophic attack, is clearly best done, if not exclusively done, from very high in space. But there are these other potential applications that can make for real problems for military hardware and other pieces of equipment that have not been hardened against it.
Yeah, I think what we talked about is a country-destroying attack. So that only happens if the attack comes in space, very high altitude, from a nuclear weapon. But if we're talking about the tactical use of EMP, that's a different story. If any of you would like to build your own EMP tactical device to destroy a couple of buildings in a downtown area, maybe you have a grudge you'd like to take care of, so go take a look at Popular Mechanics 2000, the year 2000. They had an article describing how you can build one.
Well, on that note, I want to thank our panelists for
Something else for you to do at home tonight.
I want to know what that donates right there.